Today we're going to go through the best settings for the Asus ROG Swift PG34WCDN. We've got a full review of this screen linked in the description below, so check that out if you want to know a lot more about the screen's performance. But we're going to set the screen up in both SDR and HDR modes, as well as have a look at things like OLED care settings and gaming settings. The screen is in its default factory mode. You'll see that HDR is turned off for now. You'll see a lot of the sections are actually grayed out at the moment, and that's because certainly on our unit, the power setting is on the power saving mode at the moment. We're going to change that first of all to performance mode. You'll get a warning about that, and then that will give you full access to make all the adjustments to the screen settings properly. So that's the first thing you need to change. We'll come back to gaming in a moment. First of all, we're going to set the screen up in SDR, and the main things you're going to want to change are in the image and the color menus. Now for general applications and desktop use, we think most people will want to enable the uniform brightness mode. That will help ensure that you've got a nice consistent brightness regardless of your content, your window sizes, and as you move things around. You've got a couple of different options between color space modes. We're going to leave the screen in its default wide gamut mode at the moment, and we'll come back to look at sRGB and DCI-P3 in a moment. But in the wide gamut mode, you're going to want to adjust the brightness to whatever you find comfortable and appropriate for your usage and your ambient light conditions. If you want to target specific common luminance levels, then you could set this at a level of 65 for 200 nits, at a setting of 48 for 150 nits, or a setting of 38 for 120 nits. Like I say, set this at whatever you find comfortable and appropriate for your usage. We'll just leave that on 48 for now, targeting 150 nits for argument's sake. Uniform brightness is turned on. Contrast can stay at its default setting of 80. We'll come back to talk about OLED anti-flicker in a moment. And then the other settings for SDR are in the color menu. So a lot of people will probably want to just use the screen with its full native wide color space, its wide gamut mode. That will give you the most saturated and vivid colors, probably ideal for gaming and multimedia. We'll leave it in that mode for now, and we're going to make a minor adjustment to the color temp setting. So we're going to move it out of the 6500K mode into the user mode, where we're going to adjust the RGB channels to a setting of 99 for red, 99 for green, and 100 for blue. We found that just tweaked the RGB balance nicely and gave us a color temp a little bit closer to the 6500K target. So we're going to use the user mode there. Everything else, saturation, 6-axis saturation, and gamma can stay on the defaults. That's fine. So the screen is operating now in the wide gamut mode, but with a slightly tweaked RGB balance. You might also want to try out our calibrated ICC profile. That's linked in the description below. That will clamp the color space back to sRGB for use in color aware applications. So that might give you some further tweaks and might be useful for those kind of usage. The alternative is if you want to always clamp the color space back to sRGB or DCI-P3, you've got a couple of options in the display color space menu. DCI-P3 is pretty straightforward. That will just clamp the color space slightly closer to the DCI-P3 reference. That might be useful then for a slightly less saturated image and for HDR content creation where you're working with the DCI-P3 color space. sRGB is slightly more complicated because there are actually two approaches to using sRGB. You can either clamp the color space here and then retain full access to the color temp menu, the image settings, the brightness, the contrast and everything. Or you can come in the gaming menu, and in the game visual setting, there is a mode for sRGB Cal mode. Now this mode is actually factory calibrated and to a slightly different gamma. So this is targeted to a sRGB gamma curve instead of 2.2 in the other mode. And you'll find that gives you better shadow detail and better near black detail in dark scenes. So we think actually that's probably the better mode to use. It's very well factory calibrated. You do lose access to quite a few other settings, but you do still have access to adjust the brightness to whatever you like. Set that at whatever you find comfortable. But the color menu is grayed out, so you won't be able to tweak the RGB channels in this mode. But we found, as per our review, that the performance was very close to the 6500K target, and it had good color accuracy anyway. So if you're going to clamp to the sRGB color space, we think most people will probably want to just use that sRGB Cal mode in the game visual menu. What you could do if you want to make things slightly easier for switching between the sRGB Cal mode and the normal mode, you could come in the My Favorites menu and set one of the shortcuts to access the game visual menu. So I've set it to the right arrow. If I come out of the menu, So you'll see now that if I press right, I've got a quick access menu where I can switch between the racing mode, which we'd configured to the wide color space with all those tweak settings. You could actually do that in any of the other modes, so you might want to just use the user mode perhaps instead of racing mode, and then quickly and easily switch to the sRGB Cal mode as well. So there's easy access via the shortcut key there as well. The other thing you might want to check out is Asus's Display Widget Center software. That's pretty useful for auto switching between different modes for different applications. We've got an article on our website where we explored that in more detail, so check that out if you want to know loads more about how that software works, what features are available, and how it might help with your workflow. So we'll just leave the screen running in the racing mode at the moment, where we'd set that up first of all. In the gaming menu, you can leave variable refresh rate enabled as long as you want to use G-Sync or FreeSync or whatever. There's also a load of other game settings here, but we won't go through those. You'll have to play around with those to see what you like for your usage. The shadow boost setting is quite useful in some situations for improving the near black detail, particularly in darker games and darker movies. Experiment with that and see which mode might help you. It's really going to vary depending on your usage and your content and your ambient light conditions. We found the dynamic shadow boost mode boosted things the most, but as you can see, it does sort of change the image quite drastically as well. So experiment with that if you want for certain dark gaming. In the image section, there's also the OLED anti-flicker setting. Now, if you're using variable refresh rates in this menu, then that might help mitigate some of the flicker that you might experience during VRR gaming situations. Turn that on if you have any problems, but it's really going to vary from system to system and from game to game. So it does a pretty good job here on this screen of reducing the flicker actually. So we probably recommend turning that on if you're going to leave adaptive sync turned on. In the OLED care menu, you'll want to leave as many of these settings turned on as you can to help with the mitigation of image retention. If you find any of them problematic or distracting or obvious during your usage, you can come and turn them off here. There's various things turned on, as you can see. The screen move we tend to notice during desktop usage, so you might want to turn that down to light or maybe even off if you find it really obvious. Everything else, just experiment if you have any problems, but we'd recommend leaving them on if you can. The near proximity sensor can be turned on here. That will detect your presence and turn the screen off when you move away from it. That's a pretty handy feature to turn on. You can use a tailored mode if you want to set it up specific to your viewing position and your normal distance from the screen. Or you can use one of the preset modes, that's fine as well. But we probably recommend just turning that on if you can, and then you can set the screen off timer and things like that. In the system setup menu, if you've got a DP 2.1 graphics card with UHBR20 speeds, you can actually turn off DSC here if you want, although it doesn't really offer any meaningful benefits at all. So we probably just leave that on, to be honest, as it seems to be a little bit more reliable and more stable. You know, you don't have to worry about different cables and UHBR20 cables and that kind of thing. Turn it off if you really want to. Experiment with it there, but we think most people will probably just leave that turned on. Obviously, you'll need to leave it turned on if you've got an older DP 1.4 system anyway. We've enabled Windows HDR now, and you can see that the screen has automatically switched into one of its gaming preset modes. As a reminder, we'd recommend only enabling HDR in Windows when you're going to view actual HDR content. Otherwise, leave it disabled to operate in SDR mode. In this menu, a lot of the settings are now grayed out, as you can see. You only have access by default to a few settings in the image menu, but if you come into the HDR settings menu, you can turn on adjustable HDR here, and that will give you access to more settings here if you want to tweak anything further. Now, I think most people will want to use the gaming, cinema or console mode by default. For PC gaming, it's probably easiest just to leave it in the gaming HDR mode. That will deliver you the brightest performance overall, including being able to reach up to the advertised 1300 nits peak brightness. For console gaming, you could switch to the console HDR mode, although that mode is darker by default. You'll then probably want to enable the dynamic brightness boost setting in that mode, which then makes it behave very similar to gaming and cinema modes. It's slightly over brightened in some situations, but it's a better balance overall. So for PC gaming, we probably just stick to the gaming HDR mode. Leave brightness on 100 unless you have any specific reasons to turn it down, and everything else can pretty much stay as it is. When you've got adjustable HDR enabled, you can also access the color menu if you want, although we found the default 6500K color temp was very accurate and close to the target anyway. No need to change that or anything else really. There's nothing really else to change in the HDR mode, and there's the screen therefore set up for both SDR and HDR usage. If you found this video useful, please give us a quick like below, that would be appreciated, and you can find links to our full review and our calibrated ICC profile linked in the description below as well. If you'd like to stay up to date on all of our future reviews, content and coverage from events and things like that, please remember to hit subscribe. Thank you for watching, we'll catch you next time.